The hospital room was silent, except for the steady hum of machines keeping Charles Montgomery alive. But at the doorway, a German shepherd stood motionless, watching, waiting. When the doctor reached for the plug, the dog lunged forward, eyes burning with purpose. 3. The rain pounded against the hospital windows, streaking the glass with silver rivulets that blurred the city lights beyond. Inside the dimly lit ICU, the rhythmic beeping of machines was the only sound, each pulse marking the fragile existence of Charles Montgomery, a once powerful businessman now trapped in unconscious stillness. Tubes snaked around his frail body, machines breathing for him, while the scent of antiseptic and lingering despair filled the room. But amidst the sterile coldness, one presence remained unwavering. A large German shepherd, his coat a mix of deep browns and blacks, sat at the foot of the hospital bed. His name was Max. He had been Charles's companion for years, his shadow, his confidant, his protector. Now, Max's amber eyes never left his owner, reading every flicker of movement, every change in the rhythm of the machines. To the hospital staff, Max was just a dog, loyal, yes, but ultimately powerless in the face of medicine and logic. To them, Charles was gone, a mere heartbeat sustained by artificial means. The doctors had spoken to the family, and the decision was made. At sunrise, life support would be withdrawn. Yet, Max sensed something they couldn't. He didn't understand medical charts or diagnoses, but he knew Charles better than anyone. He knew the warmth that had always existed beneath the hardened exterior, the hands that had once built an empire but had always found time to scratch behind his ears. The quiet sighs of a man who had spent a lifetime chasing wealth only to realize, too late, what truly mattered. Max's ears twitched as the door creaked open. A nurse entered, her footsteps careful. She barely spared him a glance, her attention solely on adjusting the IV drip. Max let out a low whine, his muscles coiling beneath his thick fur. Something inside him screamed that this wasn't right. Charles wasn't gone. Not yet. Max shifted, his large paws making a soft sound against the linoleum floor. He lowered his head, ears pinned back, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil in his canine heart. His gaze flickered toward the bedside table where a leather wallet sat, worn, old, but cherished. Inside was a single photograph, edges frayed from years of handling. It showed Charles as a younger man, standing beside a woman with soft eyes and a knowing smile. And in front of them, as a pup, was Max. That picture held a lifetime of regret. Because Charles had spent years alone, his fortune growing while his heart withered. The woman in the picture was long gone, and Max had been his only constant. And now, as the world prepared to say its final goodbye, Max refused to let go. He wasn't just a pet. He was the last tether to Charles's fading world. And he wasn't leaving without a fight. The hours crawled by, the storm outside intensifying as if nature itself rebelled against the inevitable. The fluorescent glow of the hospital room cast long shadows, highlighting the sharp angles of Charles Montgomery's motionless frame. His once commanding presence had withered into fragility, his skin pallid against the sterile white sheets. The machines beeped in their monotonous rhythm, uncaring, unfeeling. But Max felt everything. The German shepherd lay with his head on the cool floor, ears flicking at every sound from the hallway. Nurses passed by, their voices hushed, their conversations repetitive. Poor man, a life of wealth, but in the end, no real family. At least he won't suffer much longer. Their words were indifferent, spoken out of routine rather than malice. But they tightened something inside Max's chest, an instinctual understanding that the world had already moved on. A doctor entered the room. He was tall, middle-aged, his face lined with the weight of years spent delivering difficult news. He checked the monitors, scribbled something on the chart, then sighed. "Final checks in the morning," he murmured to the nurse beside him. "It's time." Time. Max's body tensed. He didn't know human words, not the way they thought, but he knew what time meant. He had heard it before, when Charles would sigh after looking at old photographs, whispering, "If only I had more time." He had felt it when Charles collapsed in their home weeks ago, his breath ragged, his grip weak on Max's fur as he fell. Max hadn't left his side then. He wouldn't leave now. As the doctor and nurse exited, Max lifted his head, eyes locked on the still figure of the man who had been his entire world. The scent of antiseptic masked the familiar smell of Charles, the faint musk of his cologne, the traces of cigar smoke that clung to his suits, the warmth of a life lived in solitude but never truly alone. And then, a flicker. It was small, almost imperceptibly a twitch in Charles's fingertips. Max's ears perked up, his body going rigid. He waited, breath held, but nothing more came. His heart pounded. Was it real? Or was his desperate hope playing tricks on him? He moved closer, pressing his nose against Charles's limp hand. It was cold, unresponsive, but Max knew he knew. Charles wasn't gone. A growl built in Max's throat, low and warning. He turned toward the door, eyes blazing with determination. The humans had it wrong. They were giving up too soon. But he wouldn't. Because Charles had saved him once, rescued him as a trembling pup from the side of a road, given him a home, a name, a purpose. And now, it was Max's turn to return the favor. The air inside the hospital room was thick with an eerie stillness, the kind that came before the breaking of a storm. Outside, the city moved on. Cars rushed through rain-slicked streets. People hurried home. Lives continued as if the world hadn't just decided to erase Charles Montgomery from its pages. But Max knew better. The German shepherd sat upright now, his body tense, his amber eyes flickering between his unconscious owner and the door. The doctors, the nurses, they thought Charles was beyond saving. They thought the machines were all that tethered him to this world, but Max had spent years by Charles's side. He had seen him push through long nights of exhaustion, fight battles no one else knew existed, endure the loneliness of a life filled with regret. And Max wasn't about to let that end without a fight. His ears twitched at the sound of approaching footsteps. The scent of antiseptic and coffee filled the air as the night nurse entered the room, clipboard in hand. She barely glanced at Max, accustomed to the dog's presence by now. She moved with methodical precision, checking vitals, scribbling notes, adjusting the IV. Her expression was unreadable, detached. It was just another night, another patient slipping away. Then she reached for the power button on one of the machines. Max growled. A low, guttural sound, deep and resonant, the kind of growl that sent a primal warning through the bones of anyone who heard it. The nurse froze. Her hand hovered over the machine. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting Max's. "Hey now," she whispered, frowning. "Easy boy. It's okay." But it wasn't. Max stood, muscles coiling beneath his thick fur. His tail was stiff, his ears pinned back. His body language was clear. "Didn't touch it." The nurse hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. If she called security, they'd remove the dog, maybe even sedate him. But something in Max's unwavering gaze stopped her. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. She sighed, lowering her hand, stepping back. All right, she muttered, shaking her head. "I'll wait until the doctor does final rounds in the morning." Max didn't move until she left the room. Only then did he return to Charles's bedside, nudging his owner's motionless hand with his nose. He needed to do something. He needed to make them understand. But he was just a dog. The night dragged on, each second a battle against time. Max stayed awake, his eyes flickering between the door and Charles's face. He watched for any sign, any movement, anything to prove that he was right. And then it happened. A sound. Soft, faint. A breath. Max's ears perked up. His body went still. He inched closer, his nose hovering just above Charles's lips. There it was again, a shaky, uneven breath, a whisper of life breaking through the stillness. Max barked. Loud, sharp, urgent. He barked again, stepping onto the bed, pressing his paws against Charles's chest. "Wake up!" His body trembled with desperation. "Wake up!" "Nothing!" Max growled in frustration, then did the only thing he could think of. He opened his mouth and clamped down, not hard, but firm enough onto Charles's limp wrist. A controlled bite, just enough pressure to send a jolt of sensation through unresponsive nerves. And Charles's fingers twitched. Max let go, eyes wide, breath panting. He nudged the hand again, barked louder, his tail wagging now in frantic excitement. This time the fingers moved more. A slow, sluggish attempt to respond. A miracle wrapped in the smallest of motions. Max whined, pawing at Charles's arm, licking his fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Charles was still in there. And now, Max had to make sure the world knew it. Max's heart pounded as he stared at Charles's twitching fingers. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't wishful thinking. His owner, his best friend, was in there, trapped in a body that refused to obey. And if Max could see it, why couldn't they? He needed to make them understand. Max leaped off the bed and ran to the door, his claws clicking against the cold linoleum floor. He let out a sharp, urgent bark, the sound echoing through the quiet hospital corridor. The nurses at the station barely glanced up. They were used to Max barking when he wanted attention, and they had long since learned to tune him out. But Max wouldn't be ignored. He sprinted down the hallway, weaving between carts and empty gurneys, his tail high, his ears pricked forward. His nails scratched against the floor as he skidded to a stop in front of the nurse's station. He barked again, louder, sharper, a demand, not a plea. Nurse Ellen, the only one on shift who had ever truly paid attention to Max, frowned as she looked up from her charts. "Max?" He jumped up, placing his front paws on the desk, panting wildly. His eyes burned with urgency. "Come now, follow me, hurry." She blinked, setting her pen down. "What's gotten into you?" Max whined, turned, and bolted back toward Charles's room. This time, she followed. When she entered, she froze. Charles's hand twitched again, fingers curling slightly before relaxing. The machines continued their steady beeping, no drastic changes in vitals, but Nurse Ellen knew what she had just seen. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't supposed to happen. The doctors had been certain. No brain activity, no chance of recovery. Yet, here was Charles Montgomery, defying the odds in the smallest, most miraculous way. Max whined, nudging Charles's arm again, as if saying, "Do you see? I told you." Ellen's breath hitched. "Dr. Reynolds," she called out, her voice sharp, "Get in here, now." A commotion erupted in the hallway. Moments later, Dr. Reynolds strode into the room, irritation clear in his furrowed brow. "What's the emergency?" Ellen stepped aside, gesturing toward Charles. "Watch." Max licked Charles's fingers, nudged them with his nose. And then another twitch. This time, slower but unmistakable. Dr. Reynolds' frown deepened. "That's impossible." But Max wasn't done. He climbed onto the bed again, placed his massive paws on Charles's chest, and whined long, sorrowful, pleading. "Wake up. Come back. You're not gone." Charles's breath hitched. His fingers moved again. His eyelids fluttered. The doctor took a step back, eyes wide. "Oh my God." Ellen covered her mouth. She has responding." The doctor rushed to the bedside, checking reflexes, scanning vitals, disbelief written across his face. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered. "The brain scan showed." "I don't care what the scan showed," Ellen interrupted. "Look at him. He's still in there." A moment of silence fell over the room, broken only by the steady rhythm of the machines. Then, Dr. Reynolds turned toward the door. "Cancel the life support termination. Now." Max let out a relieved huff, settling down beside Charles once more. His job wasn't done yet, but he had won the first battle. The morning light crept through the hospital blinds, painting the sterile white walls with streaks of gold. Outside, the city was waking up, honking cars, hurried footsteps, the hum of life moving forward. But inside room 417, time had frozen. Charles Montgomery still lay motionless, but something had changed. The tension in the air was undeniable. The nurses whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances at the patient they had once written off. Doctors hovered over charts, confusion etched into their features. They had been certain, absolutely certain, that Charles was beyond saving. Yet here he was, showing undeniable signs of consciousness. And at the center of it all sat Max. The German shepherd remained glued to Charles's bedside, his amber eyes watching everything, his ears twitching at every new sound. He had done his part, had stopped them from pulling the plug. But now, uncertainty loomed like a storm cloud. Would Charles wake up fully? Would it be enough? Or had Max only delayed the inevitable? Dr. Reynolds ran a hand over his face, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders. "His brain activity is still weak," he muttered to Nurse Ellen. "Yes, he's showing movement, but it could be reflexive." Ellen folded her arms, glancing at Max. "Then why did it only happen when the dog was here?" Reynolds exhaled sharply. "I don't know," he admitted, "but the family won't be happy about this." The family. Max's ears perked up. The word carried weight, even if he didn't understand all of its meaning. He had learned to recognize certain voices, certain sense people who visited Charles occasionally, but never stayed long. They smelled like expensive perfume, wore stiff clothes, and always seemed in a hurry. And now, they were coming. The door burst open, and a tall man in a tailored suit strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Behind him followed a woman, equally well-dressed, her expression tight with impatience. Max let out a low, warning growl. He knew these people. Charles's son and daughter. They had visited before, though not often. They never stayed long, and when they did, their voices were clipped, their words short. They smelled of wealth, but not warmth. The man Daniel Montgomery glanced at Charles, his brows furrowing in irritation rather than concern. "I got a call saying there was a delay with the termination." His voice was brisk, as if he were discussing a late business deal rather than his father's life. Ellen straightened. "That's correct. We observed movement. Possible signs of recovery." The woman Lillian Montgomery sighed dramatically. "Oh, for God's sake." She rubbed her temples, looking genuinely inconvenienced. "We've already signed the papers. What's the holdup?" "Have to wake up." And then something happened. A breath. A deeper, shuddering inhale. Charles's eyelids fluttered, his fingers flexing with more intent. His throat moved as if he were struggling to speak. The room went silent. Max barked again, frantic now, pushing his weight against Charles's chest, willing him to move. The machines beeped erratically as his heart rate spiked, as if responding to the battle raging inside him. Dr. Reynolds' breath hitched. "Oh my God, he's trying." Ellen rushed forward, her hands trembling as she checked Charles's pulse, shining a light into his eyes. "Charles? Mr. Montgomery, can you hear me?" A soft, raspy sound escaped from Charles's throat, a whisper of a voice, barely audible. But it was there. A sign of life. A sign of awareness. Daniel's face paled. "Number. That's impossible." Lillian took a step back, panic flickering across her carefully composed features. This doesn't change anything." But it did. Max let out a triumphant bark, his tail wagging now in wild, desperate excitement. His owner wasn't gone. He had known it all along. Dr. Reynolds turned to Daniel and Lillian, his expression firm. "We're not terminating anything. He's regaining consciousness. This discussion is over." Daniel's mouth opened, closed. He looked lost, unsure, shaken. "But—" Lillian grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his expensive suit. "We'll discuss this with our lawyer," she spat, before storming out of the room. Daniel hesitated, staring at Charles as if seeing him for the first time in years. Then, without another word, he followed his sister. The door slammed shut. Silence. Ellen let out a shaky breath, then turned to Max, a stunned smile breaking across her face. "You saved him." Max huffed, his body relaxing for the first time in days. Charles wasn't out of danger yet. The battle wasn't over. But he was still here, and as long as he fought, Max would be right there beside him. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Your father exhibited motor function in response to stimulus. We believe he may not be as unresponsive as we initially thought." Daniel scoffed. "And you're basing this on what? A twitch?" His gaze flickered toward Max, disdain flashing in his eyes. "Or are you letting the damn dog make medical decisions now?" Max growled louder. He didn't like this man. He never had. Ellen's voice was tight. "We're basing it on medical observation." Lillian crossed her arms. "I don't care. The will is clear. He wouldn't want to live like this. We're not prolonging his suffering." But Max knew. Charles wasn't suffering. He was fighting. Max let out a sharp bark and placed his paws on the bed, nudging Charles's arm. Another twitch. Ellen gasped. "There, you saw that!" Daniel's expression darkened. "Enough. We've made our decision." Max's body tensed. He could sense that they were going to take Charles away. They were going to end this. And he couldn't let that happen. Max's heart pounded as he watched the tension unfold in the room. His body remained coiled, his muscles taut beneath his thick fur. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to act to stop them, to make them understand. But how? Daniel Montgomery exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. Enough of this nonsense. He turned to Dr. Reynolds, his tone cold, businesslike. We're the legal next of kin. You have no authority to delay this any longer. Terminate the life support, today." Max barked, a sharp, commanding sound that cut through the air like a knife. Lillian flinched. God, can someone get rid of that animal? But Max wasn't going anywhere. He jumped onto the hospital bed, positioning himself over Charles, his body a shield between his owner and the heartless heirs who wanted him gone. He growled a deep, rumbling sound that came from the core of his being. His golden eyes blazed with a fire no one in that room could ignore. Ellen's voice wavered as she stepped forward. "We don't usually see this kind of response in patients who are completely brain dead," she said carefully. "I know it's not conclusive, but this isn't typical. He's showing movement, awareness. We should reassess before making any irreversible decisions." Daniel clenched his jaw. We've been over this. He wouldn't want to live this way. He left explicit instructions in his will." Ellen folded her arms. "He also left behind a living body that's trying to fight back." Lillian scoffed. "Oh, please, he's not fighting back. It's just muscle spasms. You doctors say so yourselves all the time. Reflexive movement means nothing." Max knew better. He turned back to Charles and did the only thing left in his power. He pressed his nose against Charles's cheek, licking his skin, nudging his limp face with careful urgency. "Wake up, you." The hospital room was silent again, but this time it wasn't the cold, final silence of death. It was something different, something waiting, something unresolved. The air was heavy, thick with tension, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Max didn't move from his spot beside Charles. His body was pressed close, his ears flicking at every tiny shift in his owner's breathing. The doctors had seen the movement, the faint whisper of a voice, but Charles hadn't fully woken up. Not yet. And that terrified Max. The storm outside raged on, thunder rumbling in the distance. Each crack of lightning illuminated the hospital room for a brief second, casting ghostly shadows along the walls. The machines beeped steadily, an ever-present reminder that Charles was still alive, but for how long? Max whimpered softly, resting his head on the thin hospital sheet that covered Charles's unmoving chest. "Wake up. Please wake up." But Charles remained still. Ellen had stayed for a while, but eventually the night shift had taken over, and she had left, promising to return first thing in the morning. The new nurses didn't pay much attention to Max, too wrapped up in their own routines. The room felt lonelier than ever. Max closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He couldn't. Instead, his mind drifted back to the beginning, to the very first day Charles had brought him home. He had been a trembling, scrawny pup, abandoned on the side of a rural highway, barely clinging to life. The world had been a blur of hunger and fear until Charles had stopped his sleek black car on the empty road. Max remembered the way the man had knelt down, extending a hesitant hand. "Hey, boy," he had murmured, his voice warm, unsure. "You're all alone, huh?" Max had been too weak to resist as Charles scooped him up, wrapping him in his expensive coat, shielding him from the wind. "All right," Charles had sighed. "Guess it's just you and me now." From that moment on, Max had belonged to him. Through the years, Charles had built a life of wealth and power, filling his world with polished offices, sleek cars, and towering buildings. But Max had seen the cracks beneath it all the nights Charles sat in his leather chair, drinking in silence, staring at old photographs. The way he would run a hand through his silver-streaked hair, sighing as if the weight of his past was crushing him. Regret. Max didn't understand human words, but he understood feelings. And Charles had carried regret like an invisible chain around his neck. Now, lying beside him in this cold, sterile room, Max felt that same regret hanging between them like a ghost. He had stopped them from pulling the plug, had fought to keep Charles alive, but what if it wasn't enough? What if Charles never woke up? The thought sent a shiver down Max's spine. He had always believed in his owner's strength, in his ability to push forward no matter how much the world tried to break him. But now, Charles was trapped inside himself, unreachable. Max let out a small, broken whine. He had never felt helpless before. Lightning flashed again, followed by a deep roll of thunder. The storm was relentless, mirroring the turmoil inside him. Then a sound. Soft, faint. A whisper. "Max?" Max's ears shot up. He lifted his head, staring at Charles's face. Had he imagined it? But then another sound. A ragged inhale. a shift in his owner's throat, and then, finally, a voice. "Max." It was barely more than a breath, weak and hoarse, but it was real. Max barked a sharp, desperate sound, his tail thumping against the bed as he jumped up, licking Charles's face, whimpering in joy. Charles's eyelids fluttered, his fingers twitched, his breath came in shallow gasps, as if he were clawing his way back from the depths of something dark and endless. "Good boy," Charles rasped, his lips barely moving. Max whined, licking his hand, nudging his face. "I'm here. I never left." Tears burned in Max's eyes, not that dogs could cry the way humans did, but something deep inside him ached, something raw and fierce and filled with relief. He had done it. Charles had come back. And no one, not Daniel, not Lillian, not anyone, was going to take him away now. The moment Charles Montgomery's lips parted to rasp Max, the world shifted. Max barked again, a sharp, joyous sound that filled the sterile hospital room. His tail thumped against the sheets as he licked Charles's trembling fingers, his entire body vibrating with relief. Charles was back. He was fighting. But it wasn't over. The machines beeped erratically as Charles's vitals fluctuated. His eyelids fluttered, his chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. His body was weak, fragile, teetering between life and something else. Max could sense it. The battle was far from won. The door burst open. A nurse rushed in, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. "Doctor," she called over her shoulder, her voice urgent. "Get Dr. Reynolds in here now." Footsteps thundered down the hall. Within seconds, Dr. Reynolds and Nurse Ellen burst into the room, their faces frozen in shock. "He's awake," Ellen whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the fragile miracle before them. Dr. Reynolds rushed to Charles's bedside, checking his vitals, shining a light into his half-open eyes. "Mr. Montgomery?" he said cautiously. "Can you hear me?" Charles's lips parted again, but no words came, only a rough, dry gasp. Ellen grabbed a small sponge soaked in water and gently pressed it to his lips. "Take it slow," she murmured. "You've been unconscious for..." Max didn't move. He remained pressed close, his fur bristling with tension. He knew Charles was trying, but was it enough? Then the doors flew open again. Daniel Montgomery stormed inside, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. Lillian followed close behind, her face tight with frustration. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel barked, his gaze locking onto his father. Dr. Reynolds straightened, his expression neutral but firm. "Your father has regained consciousness." Lillian let out a harsh laugh, shaking her head. No, that's impossible. We signed the papers. We were prepared for..." "You were prepared for his death," Ellen snapped, her eyes burning with anger. "But he's alive, and he's aware." Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides. "We had an agreement," he ground out. "Dad didn't want to live hooked up to machines. He made it clear." Max growled, his body shifting in front of Charles as if to shield him from his own blood. Charles's fingers twitched again. He was trying so hard. Lillian stepped closer, her voice lowering into something cold, venomous. "Dad." Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the side of the bed as she leaned over him. "If you can hear me, you know what you wanted. You wouldn't want this." Max barked. Don't listen to her." Charles's breath hitched. His mouth opened slightly, his throat working, his voice barely above a whisper. A flicker of something passed over Charles's face. Not sadness, not anger, something else. "They already made their choice," he murmured. "Now, I make mine." Max's ears perked. He didn't understand human words the way they did, but he felt the shift in Charles, the weight of something falling away. For years, Charles Montgomery had carried regret, like an anchor around his neck. The money, the power it, had built walls, not bridges. His children had grown up watching him chase a world that could never love him back, and when they saw him at his weakest, they hadn't fought for him. But Max had. Charles let out a slow, measured breath. His body still felt foreign, like he was wearing something too heavy to move in. But he wasn't gone. And as long as he was here, he wasn't done. His eyes moved toward the nightstand, where his wallet still rested, the worn leather edges fraying from years of use. Inside, it was a photo phone he had carried for decades. Max whined softly as Charles's fingers twitched toward it. Ellen, understanding without needing to ask, picked up the wallet and carefully pulled out the photo. She placed it in Charles's trembling hand. His breath hitched as he looked at it. The picture was old, its colors faded, the edges curled. A woman with kind eyes and a knowing smile stood beside a much younger Charles Montgomery. And at their feet, sitting proudly in the center, was a German shepherd puppy Max. Not this Max, his father. Charles blinked hard, his chest ached not with pain, but with something deeper. Regret, love, hope. "You've been with me my whole life, haven't you?" he murmured, looking down at the Max lying beside him now, one way or another. Max let out a soft woof, as if answering, "Always." Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Mr. Montgomery, you need to rest. Your body has been through hell if you push too hard." "I'm not dying today," Charles interrupted, a ghost of a smirk playing at his lips. "So, doctor, what do we do next?" Reynolds raised an eyebrow, surprised by the shift in his patient. Just hours ago, Charles had been unresponsive, at death's door. Now there was a spark behind those tired eyes of fire not even his own children had been able to extinguish. "Well," Reynolds said, exhaling, "first we work on getting you strong again. And second, you'll need to decide what happens with your estate, considering your next of kin assumed you'd be dead," Charles finished for him. His voice had lost its rasp, settling into something firmer. "Yes, I imagine they were eager." Ellen hesitated. "Sir, they didn't fight for you." Charles looked down at Max, running his fingers weakly through his fur. "I know," he murmured. A silence stretched between them. It wasn't bitter, it was final. Then Charles took another slow, deliberate breath and smiled. They made their choice. His voice was quiet but certain. "Now, it's time to make mine." Max lifted his head, his golden eyes locking onto Charles's. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. "Stop talking." The room went deathly silent. Daniel took a step back as if struck. Lillian's mouth parted, her face going pale. Dr. Reynolds leaned in. "Mr. Montgomery?" Charles's throat moved, his voice hoarse, cracked. "Not your decision." Max let out a triumphant whimper, nudging his owner's arm. "Yes, keep going. You can do this." Lillian's expression twisted into something ugly. "Dad, we're just trying to do what's best." Charles's fingers twitched again. His chest rose and fell with a deep, slow breath. And then, in a voice that was weak but unmistakably clear, he rasped, "Get out." Lillian staggered back as if slapped. Daniel's jaw tightened, his face unreadable. "Fine," he bit out, "but this isn't over." He turned on his heel, his sister following in stunned silence. The moment the door shut behind them, Charles's body sagged against the bed. Dr. Reynolds exhaled a slow breath. "That's enough for now," he said, adjusting the foredrip. "You need rest." Ellen wiped her eyes, her hands shaking. "You did it," she whispered. "You fought." But Charles wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Max. His lips curled into something small, weak, but undeniably real. A smile. Max let out a soft huff and rested his head on Charles's chest, his body finally relaxing. His battle was won. But Charles's fight wasn't over yet. The hospital room felt heavier now, not with grief, but with exhaustion, the kind that comes after barely surviving a battle. The storm outside had begun to wane, the thunder rolling further into the distance, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of raindrops against the glass. Charles Montgomery was alive. Weak, struggling, but alive. Max lay beside him, his warm body curled protectively against Charles's side. His ears flicked at every small sound, the beeping machines, the rustling of paperwork, the murmurs of the medical staff outside. But his heartbeat, once frantic with fear, had finally begun to slow. The worst was over. Dr. Reynolds adjusted Charles IV, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Your vitals are stabilizing," he murmured. "But your body is still weak. You'll need physical therapy, cognitive exercises, time." Charles, still unable to fully lift his head, let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Time, never had enough of it before. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was there, full of life. Max nuzzled Charles's arm, letting out a soft huff. "I knew you'd come back." Ellen smiled through the tears still shining in her eyes. "You scared us, Mr. Montgomery." Charles swallowed hard, his throat still raw from disuse. His gaze drifted down to Max. who remained still and steadfast beside him. He painfully slowly lifted his shaking hand and let his fingers brush against Max's fur. "Guess he didn't give up on me," Charles rasped. Ellen chuckled. "Not for a second." Dr. Reynolds sighed, closing the file in his hand. "Your children won't be happy about this," he warned. The following days passed in a blur of whispered conversations, hurried footsteps, and the steady hum of medical machines. The hospital staff still moved cautiously around Charles, as if afraid the miracle of his recovery might suddenly reverse itself. But Charles Montgomery was done teetering on the edge of death. He was getting stronger. Max never left his side, not even once. When the physical therapists came, forcing Charles to move his fingers, then his hands, then his legs, Max watched intently, his tail wagging in encouragement. When the doctors checked his vitals, Max remained close, ensuring they understood what he already knew: his owner wasn't leaving this world yet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a morning filled with golden light. It streamed through the hospital window, warming the room with a soft glow. The scent of antiseptic still lingered in the air, but it no longer smelled like death. Charles sat propped up in bed, his once weak hands now able to grip a pen. His lawyer stood beside him, briefcase open, documents neatly stacked. "You're sure about this, Mr. Montgomery?" the man asked, adjusting his glasses. Charles exhaled, his fingers tracing the faded photograph still resting on his lap. The one of his younger self, of the woman he had once loved, of the first German shepherd that had ever sat at his feet. "Yes," he said firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He reached forward, flipping through the document's new will. Everything had changed in the past few days. His children, if they could even be called that, had left in anger, their true colors laid bare. They hadn't visited him since the night he had spoken those simple words, "Get out." Not a single call, not a single question about his health. They had written him off when they thought he was too weak to fight back. Now, he was writing them out of his life. Instead, his new will left nearly everything: his estate, his properties, his wealth to something far more meaningful, a foundation that would provide homes, shelter, and training for rescue dogs. Dogs like Max. Dogs who had more loyalty, more love, more soul than most humans ever could. Max lifted his head as if sensing the shift in the room. He let out a soft woof, and Charles chuckled, scratching behind his ears. "Don't worry, boy, you'll be taken care of too." The lawyer cleared his throat. "And your children?" Charles's expression didn't change. They made their choice. The lawyer nodded, adjusting his tie. "Understood." Charles took the pen in his now steady hand and, without hesitation, signed his name, the final act of a man reclaiming his life. As soon as the last signature was set, Max let out a happy bark and jumped onto the bed, his massive paws pressing into Charles's lap. Charles left a deep, genuine sound he hadn't made in years. All right," he muttered, scratching Max's head. "We did it." Max leaned into him, his golden eyes filled with the same loyalty and love they had held from the beginning. He had fought to save Charles. And now, Charles had finally learned to fight for himself. As the morning sun rose higher, spilling light into every corner of the hospital room, Charles Montgomery knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone. He never had been. And for the first time in a long, long time, he was ready to live. Call to action. Loyalty, love, and second chances sometimes. They come from the most unexpected places. Max never gave up on Charles, and in the end, that love saved a life. Would you fight for someone the way Max did? Would you stand by them when everyone else walked away? If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where an animal's love changed everything? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories like this one. Because sometimes, the ones who save us aren't even human.